So welcome to Tipping Points, where we ask the questions that matter about conservation and development. I am Sally Archibald. I'm a professor at the School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Sciences. Together with Laura Pereira, I lead the Future Ecosystems for Africa program, which is funded by Oppenheimer Generations and works with scientists across the continent to impact conservation and development. Future Ecosystems is developing a variety of tools to inform local interventions and also to influence national and international policy. The webinar presented today is a key example of the importance of this work and the value that can be gained from harnessing knowledge and insights of our African scientists and enabling their voices to be heard. So I hope that we can get some stimulating ideas, both from the panel and from the audience, that will help us to move forwards and enhance our impact as we move towards COP27. I'm really pleased to introduce our outstanding panel. They are pioneers in the field and they're hand-selected to give a really interdisciplinary perspective. We have 3 panelists today. I'm going to introduce all of them now. And the first speaker will be Laura Pereira. She's an associate professor at, and she's the Exxaro Research Chair at the Global Change Institute at Wits University, as well as being a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. She's an interdisciplinary sustainability scientist, trained in ecology, law, zoology, and human geography. Laura is a co-PI of Future Ecosystems for Africa with me, and she sits on the IPBES task force on scenarios and models. Then Mohammed Armani is a plant ecologist at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. His current research focuses on elucidating the trajectories of change across distinct biomes in the forest-savanna boundary of West Africa under recent climate and land use change. Armani has recently compiled a comprehensive report enhancing climate change adaptation and mitigation actions on land in Africa, and also has a background in forestry. Dr. Ibukun Adewumi is a blue economy and ocean policy researcher and development expert with over a decade of experience. Ibukun has an interest in exploring how ocean-based action can be integrated into climate policy decision. He's currently the Ocean Governance Officer and Partnerships Coordinator at the Global Ocean Accounts Partnership and a researcher at the Australian Centre for Ocean Resources and Security. So those of you who've attended previous sessions will know that we try to run for about 30 minutes in terms of presentations from the panelists, and then followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. We also then will keep it open for more relaxed discussion after the official program ends, because often there's a lot of stimulating ideas that come from the audience and expertise that we want to engage with. Please, as I've mentioned, direct all questions to the chat box and we will accumulate them and manage them and have them spoken out during the Q&A session. It's great to see all the people here. We have a nice group of people and we will start by introducing Laura Pereira. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Sally, and great to see everyone here joining us for this conversation. I am not going to be sharing any slides. I'm just going to give a very general sort of background information on sort of why we engaged in this process of commissioning these reports to sort of feed into an Africa position to go into the COP27 that's going to be happening in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt in November. But thought I'd also give a little bit of background just on what we even mean by COP and what are these conventions that we talk about and how do they link together and why do we even need a position on them? Hopefully I'll be clear. Please do feel free to sort of type in the chat if anything is unclear and we can try and get back to that at the end. But you know, this is just to give you sort of all just a baseline understanding. So when a lot of the language starts to fly around, we have a sense of what that means. So in essence, there were 3 conventions that emerged from the Earth Summit that happened in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And I think we all recall that in 2002, we had the follow-up Earth Summit here in Johannesburg, those of us who were around. And then we had the Rio Plus 20 that took place in Rio again in sort of 10 years after that. And in essence, what emerged from this was this notion of Agenda 21, which was a way to contribute to this idea of sustainable development. And there were 3 conventions that are linked to trying to achieve Agenda 21. This is the Convention on Biological Diversity, also referred to as the CBD. The objectives of this are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from commercial and other utilization of genetic resources associated with biodiversity. And so this covers all ecosystems, species, genetic resources. It's kind of the Biodiversity Convention. The second one is the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD. Lots of acronyms. I will try not to use them when I explain this, but this convention was aiming to combat desertification and to mitigate the effects of drought in countries that tend to experience these, particularly focused on Africa, and through effective actions at sort of multiple different levels and supported by international cooperation. The third one, which is the one that most of us are most aware of, is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is an overall framework for intergovernmental efforts to tackle the challenge posed by climate change. Its objectives are to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, which means in the current state that's drastically reducing our emissions. And this is also within a time frame to allow ecosystems and humans to be able to adapt naturally to a change in climate, to ensure that food production is not threatened and to still can enable economic development to proceed. So interesting combinations. In essence, that's the Climate Change Convention. So each of these conventions have meetings called COPs, or Conference of the Parties, where all of those countries who are signatories to these conventions come together and meet to discuss additional components, how well they've done, how they haven't, sort of more things that need to be negotiated. So this for the UNFCCC tends to happen every year. And so one of the most well-known ones was the COP3 that happened in Kyoto, where the Kyoto Protocol was put forward. I think a lot of people had heard about that. That's when we actually got some binding commitments for particular countries to start to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This then expired in, I think it was 2015. And so there was a bit of a rush to try and get, well, what is the next set of commitments that was going to come up? There was a lot of hype around the 2009 COP15 meeting that was going to take place in Copenhagen, but actually sort of fell flat in bringing all the countries together to reach a decision. But then finally, I think we're all quite familiar with the Paris Agreement that was then reached at COP21 in 2015. That then allowed us to sort of have the next iteration of commitments for countries to lower their emissions. So last year, we had COP26 that took place in Glasgow. And it was sort of around those discussions that really sparked this endeavor to try and help formulate an African position that could talk to sort of multiple different components of these conventions. And in particular, the most important thing just to know is that we've got COP27 coming up in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. It's being dubbed kind of the Africa COP. And that's sort of really important for us to sort of have a strong African position going into that. Just a little bit of update. There's not, so the UNCCD, the Desertification Convention is also still ongoing, but doesn't have anything upcoming that needs to be sort of importantly negotiated. However, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, they had a set of what we call the global biodiversity targets, or the IT targets, that came into effect during a meeting in Japan. These expired in 2020. And so sort of similar to what the climate negotiators were trying to do around what was going to replace the Kyoto Protocol, the ongoing discussions on what the next global biodiversity framework is going to look at. That meeting was supposed to happen in Kunming in 2020, but we all know what happened in 2020. And so we've had a series of ongoing online discussions. This year, some in-person discussions also happened, or meetings happened in Geneva and Nairobi. And finally, the COP15 for the Convention on Biological Diversity is going to take place in Montreal, Canada in December this year. So you can see two really important meetings, one around biodiversity happening in December, and sort of the next COP around the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. And then finally, just it's not part of these 3 Rio conventions, but there's an ongoing discussion on what we call the BBNJ, or the Convention on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, which formally would sit under the UN Convention Law of the Sea. This was established in 1982 at a meeting in Jamaica, if anyone sort of cares to know, which is a legal framework that sort of sets up all requirements for marine activities. And in 2015, there was a committee that was sort of put into place to elaborate the text for an internationally legally binding instrument under this UN convention to look at the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity outside areas of national jurisdiction. So in areas that aren't sitting within within territories, sort of 200 nautical miles, but sitting in the areas that aren't under a country's jurisdiction at the moment. So that's another important discussion that is ongoing. So you can see a lot of these intergovernmental negotiations are happening around the environment. And it's really important to make sure that we actually have some alignment between these, because they are all supposed to be achieving this Agenda 21 sort of protocol around sustainable development. And so what is Africa's position in all of this? It's very well established, particularly within the Climate Change Convention. Africa is the region that's least responsible for climate change, but it's going to be facing many of the impacts, including to our biodiversity and through increased degradation. And so the linkages between these components are very important. And so in 2015, the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, which is called AGNES, was established. And they aim to provide scientific expertise and evidence to inform a common African position, particularly around the climate change negotiations, and to facilitate exchange of ideas between countries and experts. So they utilize scientific evidence as a tool that can be sort of help inform what position African negotiators should be taking in these discussions, which is extremely important, because quite often when you go to these negotiations, you'll see maybe 1 or 2 negotiators, if you're lucky, coming from a lot of the least developed countries, but you'll have an entire sort of 20, 30 sort of flock of people sort of coming in from the US and other countries that have a lot of capacity to be able to negotiate. So having a common position, being able to negotiate as the African bloc is really important. In particular, they focus on defending positions on agriculture and gender. Agriculture got formally included in the UNFCCC in the climate change negotiations at COP13 in Bali in 2007, where it was added as a sectoral approach under an ad hoc working group. And then actually at the COP that took place in Durban in South Africa, COP17, it was added into a more formal position. So agriculture is on the table. It's a really important discussion document from an African perspective. But the other really important components are around adaptation, which has got an increasingly more resonance, and particularly around the financial flows, around, for example, loss and damage that many countries in the South are going to experience as a result of climate change. How are we actually going to be able to pay them for that? And so you can see a lot of financial flows actually come through the UNFCCC, which is sort of not necessarily the case for biodiversity or for desertification. And so it's really strategic to be able to align the outcomes around biodiversity also within the UNFCCC, so that some of the funding we need can actually work through that mechanism. So last year in COP26 in Glasgow, we realized we really needed a consolidated effort to help negotiators understand a lot of the new elements that were starting to come in. Ibukun's going to talk to the ocean component, which was finally tabled and included at the discussions last year. Food is now coming in, not just agriculture. And so also because a lot of the money is coming through the UNFCCC around mitigation, for example, the idea of plant more trees, particularly in Africa, this tends to get funding, but this could directly contradict some of the other sort of outcomes that we want to see achieved through, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so how can we make sure that those sorts of perverse outcomes don't actually necessarily get funded through this mechanism, but that a much more holistic approach is taken? And so this is when we connected together with AGNES to work with Ibukun and Mohammed to undertake the epic task that they are going to be presenting on today, which was to really come up with what is the evidence, what is the scientific evidence around climate change, land adaptation, as well as ocean adaptation and mitigation, and how could we try to inform an African position going forward. So hopefully that that has sort of laid the groundwork of sort of where we're coming from in terms of the conventions and what we were trying to achieve by them. And I look forward to the ongoing discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. I know that certainly made a lot of things clear for me, and I hope it did for other people. Please ask questions in the chat of Laura if there's any questions of clarity that you need from her. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Armani, Mohammed Armani. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks a lot, Sally, and thanks, Laura, for setting the framework. My name is Mohammed Armani. I'm currently based in Kumasi, in Ghana. And in the next 10 to 12 minutes, I'll be sharing some of the results that we have for the review that we conducted to establish the evidence in support of the various proposed climate actions for Africa. Okay, great. Here's the outline of my talk. For time reasons, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but essentially the idea is to give you a bit of background, but because Laura has already done quite a good job with setting the background for us, so I won't also spend a lot of time on the background. Generally, I wanted to show you the scope of the report, the kind of climate actions that we were interested in, and the ecosystems and the land use types that we were interested in assessing. And also to highlight some of based on the literature review that we did, to highlight some of the major key agreements that we can all agree on. And I think everybody here will agree with those points. And then also to share the 6 main points that we identified looking at the literature on climate actions in Africa. And also to highlight some of the key evidence that we have in support of the different climate actions that has been proposed for the different ecosystems. Then I'll end up with a small take-home message. So essentially, as Laura mentioned, the report on climate actions on land in Africa was initiated by Agnes in February this year, together with the partners, the relevant partners, so OGRC, NEPAD, and also the University of Wits. And the goal is essentially to try to deepen our understanding of the relationship between land and climate change mitigation and adaptation in Africa. Specifically, we were interested in looking at 4 key areas. First was to review the existing information on climate actions, particularly with a particular focus on open or grassy ecosystems in Africa. Secondly, we were interested in identifying the leading examples of climate actions that do meet, as Laura said, meet both carbon goals, but also biodiversity and other sustainable development goals, particularly those linked to livelihood of the local and the rural communities. We were also interested in highlighting the main research and data gaps that we have in assessing the different climate actions. And on the basis of the first 3, to start to develop a common position for Africa on climate actions on land. So to achieve these goals, we undertook 2 major activities. The first one was to undertake a very extensive literature review, looking at all the evidence that we can find the case studies that are available on the different climate actions that are proposed for Africa and that are implemented within Africa. And also to undertake some consultation with key experts that were identified before we even started this work, but also through a number of activities and conferences that I attended within 3 months of start of the report writing. The idea here was very simple. First, we wanted to be able to summarize the climate trends in Africa and also to identify the key commitments made by the African countries. And on the basis of the literature review and the expert consultation, to be able to highlight the synergies and the potential trade-offs that are associated with climate actions, particularly those targeting carbon, biodiversity conservation, and rural livelihood. The scope of our analysis was to look at all climate actions. And generally, these climate actions, we can categorize them into two main pathways. Those that are linked to emission reduction, that is activities that target increased release of stored CO2. For instance, one of such major pathway has to do with the conservation or protection of natural ecosystems, such as forests, woodlands, peatlands, grasslands. And the second activity under this is those linked to sustainable agriculture. As you are all aware, agriculture is a major source of CO2 emission. So activities that target reducing CO2 emission from agriculture also falls under the emission reduction category. The second pathway has to do with the carbon dioxide removal pathway, and this essentially involves three main activities. Activities that seek to restore degraded ecosystems, and therefore by having grasses or trees growing to be able to sequester atmospheric CO2. Those linked to agroforestry, which involves the integration of trees on croplands or pasture lands, such that such growing trees will provide carbon sequestration benefits, and those that are linked essentially to the improved or sustainable management of ecosystem, such that their capacity to sequester and to store carbons will be maintained. As at the moment, the report is, the first draft has been completed. It covers about 91 pages with over 430 studies reviewed, and it's currently undergoing expert review, but it's available to be shared with people who are interested in having a read. So now I will try to first identify some of the key things that we learned from undertaking all this review. And this is the first part where I said that I think generally everybody here will agree that these 4 points are acceptable and they are generally agreed across all the literature. The first one being that climate change represents one of the most significant threats to sustainable development in Africa. I think I don't need to explain that. I think there's a general agreement on that. Secondly, there's a great consensus across the literature that land-based climate actions in Africa are crucial, not only in enhancing climate resilience in Africa, but also globally. And there's a general recognition of Africa being uniquely positioned because of its vast arable lands, but also because of its diverse and largely intact ecosystem, which can play a significant role in climate change mitigation and adaptation. There's also a high potential for renewable energy in Africa. An important consideration, an important observation across all the literature is that although Africa is uniquely positioned, we also have to be careful because implementation of climate actions in Africa can have both positive and negative impact on sustainable development. And therefore climate actions, when are being proposed, have to be context specific. Across the case studies that we looked at, also across the general document that has been produced by the African Union, there's an emphasis on the notion that climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation actions should be strongly linked to sustainable development. And the focal point of the African climate change strategy, as I've said before, has to do with the use of land and natural resources because of the abundance on the continent, to leverage that for seeking financing and technology for sustainable development. So natural resources and our land play a key role in climate change adaptation and mitigation, and also sustainable development in Africa. And that is recognized across the different nationally determined contributions from the governments across the continent. Again, there's the general expectation that climate change mitigation in Africa, climate change actions in Africa should generally be geared towards more of adaptation, but opportunities for mitigations should be considered, where this brings in financing and also technology. And actions linked to climate change mitigation and adaptation also cut across different landscapes, from intact ecosystems to transformed landscapes such as urban and agricultural lands. So this, the blue line here basically depicts the positioning of Africans' framework for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So most actions that we have so far should fall within this circle. So another important highlight that we obtained from the analysis was that natural resources are important for climate change mitigation and adaptation in Africa. And therefore, in implementing or proposing climate actions, a number of minimum criteria has to be met to ensure that these climate actions that are proposed for Africa do not have extremely negative consequences. And the literature identifies about 6 of these points. The first of which is that climate actions should seek to reduce climate threat and risks to socio-ecological systems in Africa. It must address sustainable development goals, particularly those linked to biodiversity conservation and livelihoods. It must improve natural resource governance and should also endeavor to reduce land inequalities and tenure constraints. This is particularly important in Africa, given the nature of land customary land tenure systems that we have. There is a high risk that most of the proposed climate actions, which often focus on large-scale implementation, are likely to actually deepen land inequalities and lead to extreme climate insecurities, as the next point says, specifies. Finally, across all the literature, there's quite a clear push that climate actions in Africa should be based on sound ecological understandings, and that we need to take into consideration the different structure, functioning, and dynamics of the different ecosystems that we have. Although this is strongly stated, it doesn't seem to be the case that most of the climate actions that are implemented do take this into consideration. And this point is particularly important because most proposals for climate actions in Africa first come up with the idea that these ecosystems, or where these climate actions are being implemented, are generally going to improve the functioning of the ecosystems. So it depends on first an understanding of, or the definition of what ecosystem is, what are its dynamics, structure, and processes, and how the proposed climate actions are going to improve these. And then the next step was for us to really look into critically what are the evidence for the different climate actions that have been proposed. To do this, we considered first and foremost all the major biomes in Africa, which are forests, mostly in West Africa and Central Africa, which forms the main forest block. We also looked at the extensive grassy ecosystems, and also looked a bit into the desert formations that we have in North Africa and also in Southern Africa. We did not focus only on ecosystems, but we also looked at agriculture, and we also looked at urban climate actions. However, it's important to emphasize that in the presentation, the results that I'll be giving, due to time limitation, I'll be focusing more on the ecosystem part. Particularly, I'll be looking more at the mangroves, forests, and more of the grassy ecosystem. So without spending my time, we have a bit of mangroves in Africa. Generally, the consideration is that Africa accounts for about 19% of the global mangrove cover. A large stretch of the mangroves are found in West and Central Africa, and are of importance to several nature-based industries, such as coastal fisheries, wood and non-wood product source industry, but also are very important for coastal protection. And a number of issues currently threaten the mangroves in Africa. In terms of mangrove climate actions, we can classify them basically into 3 groups, linked to conservation, which is avoided deforestation, linked to improved management, and restoration. I'm not going to go into the details of what the result is for each of them, but generally I wanted to emphasize that if you look at across the climate actions that have been implemented in Africa, they tend to, for mangroves, they tend to have positive impacts on carbon storage, on biodiversity, and on livelihoods. And there are a number of factors that seem to be pushing or influencing the success of these initiatives.
Mohammed, can I just indicate you probably have only a few minutes left?
Okay. When we consider for forest and climate actions in forest, the obvious result that comes out is that when you conserve forest, those linked to REDD+ initiatives and all the financing linked to avoided deforestation seems to have positive impact on carbon, biodiversity, and livelihood. Improved forest management also seems, the results or the evidence suggests that improved forest management tend to have positive impact on carbon and biodiversity. However, these improved forest management practices, particularly those linked to community-based improved forest management and concession-based IFM, may trade off with livelihood goals. So there needs to be a bit more care there. In terms of restoration, there's generally a positive impact across all the different goals. However, the degree or the extent of the positive impact depends more on the restoration pathway. So that is whether you use natural regeneration, mixed species plantation, or monoculture. Importantly, fire management seems to have significant positive impact across all goals. When we consider grassy ecosystems, which are quite extensive, with about 55% of Africa being grassy, what we observe is that for avoided conversion of grassland, generally there are two pathways by which grasslands are converted or being converted in Africa to farmland, or through the encouragement for tree planting or afforestation. What we tend to find is that conversion to farmland has negative carbon and biodiversity impact, but has some positive benefits for livelihood. However, the proposal for afforestation, when you look through all the literature that we can find, the carbon benefits of afforestation in grassland is very questionable. There's clear demonstrated negative impact of afforestation on biodiversity, and the livelihood benefits are also questionable, given that most livelihood schemes in this grassy ecosystem are often linked mostly to also grazing and ranching or livestock production. Similarly, most of the proposals that are made for improved management of grassy ecosystems that are linked to climate actions, such as reduction or avoiding burning, or promotion of early dry season fire over late dry season fire, or the idea that maybe bush encroachment, which is widespread now across all grassy ecosystems in Africa, may deliver carbon benefit. The results or the evidence does not support that. Actually, what we tend to find is that there is quite a significant negative impact of all these proposals on biodiversity and also livelihoods. There are also climate actions linked to grazing management for grassy ecosystems. There's quite limited evidence that the two major proposed ones, such as the short intense rational grazing and the holistic management, do deliver some carbon benefit, but I say some because the evidence is very limited. However, it's questionable what the positive impacts of these are on biodiversity and livelihood. Lastly, there's some support for the idea that the wider rangeland concept, which involves rewilding, may have positive benefit across carbon, biodiversity, and livelihood goals, but empirical evidence is very limited, and it remains to be seen whether this can be adopted on a large scale, given the land tenure systems and the potential human-wildlife conflict issues that we have. There's a lot of evidence that restoring grassy ecosystem can provide carbon, biodiversity, and livelihood benefit, but it does not equate tree planting. So tree planting doesn't lead to grassland restoration. There are many examples of appropriate ways of restoring grassland, and I have listed a few of them. And the literature has a huge consensus on the need to integrate more traditional indigenous knowledge in this respect. So the take-home message here, I'll focus mostly on the grassy ecosystem. And the main findings from the report is that evidence for proposed climate actions for Africa's grassy ecosystem are very sparse. We also recognize significant trade-off between climate actions, biodiversity conservation, and livelihoods in grassy ecosystem. The report covers much more area and much more stuff than I can present in 10 minutes. So I will encourage you, if you're interested in reading the report, to reach out to any of us and we will give the link to you or we will send you a copy. I have support from a number of people in writing the report. They are mentioned here. And now I'll stop here for questions or comments.
Great, thank you, Armani. I'm sorry, I am going to have to move quickly on to Ibukun to give him some time and also make time for questions. Thank you very much. Ibukun, I look forward to your presentation.
My name is Ibukun Adewumi, and as Shali already introduced me, I'm based in Sydney. I work for the Global Ocean Account Partnership. So I'm going to be doing justice to this topic, particularly as it relates to the integration of ocean-based adaptation action and ocean-based adaptation and mitigation action into national policy in Africa. So, and in case you need another introduction of me, you can see here, I'm here not only because I'm an African or because I'm a researcher, I'm here also because I love the ocean, and I'm all at the same time aware of the implications of our habits and also the cumulative impact of the socioeconomic and cultural activities on the ocean, and also the impact of climate change. So, like Armani also mentioned earlier, there are 5 guiding research questions to be answered in the report that was commissioned. And first of that question was for us to understand the status of integration as it, pertaining to ocean and coastal actions in national climate policies. So we intended to look into several climate change policies in Africa, including the nationally determined contribution, national action plans, etc. And we were also interested in asking, we were committed actually to know which of the international ocean governance framework that African countries are committed to and how we can align those with climate change conference of party negotiation that is coming up in Egypt. And the third one was to show example of best practices of indigenous and local knowledge into ocean-based action in Africa. And we were also interested in knowing the existing methodologies and metrics that are already being used to measure progress in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation, and how that can be beneficial for the African continent. And the fifth question was regarding how to set a position for African negotiators as we move towards COP27. It's a long report, I think about 150 plus pages. And the report in itself has been compartmentalized into several chapters. One was to set the stage, and of course, in alignment with the objective of the report itself. So in setting the stage, I think we all agree that the climate crisis is an existential crisis, which is really having devastating effect on not only the society, but also ecosystems, which includes coastal marine ecosystem. And Of course, we might want to view, I mean, considering what is happening, the impact of climate change, you might want to believe that the ocean is a victim. We are seeing issues of ocean acidification, intense or extreme weather condition, habitat degradation, but also the ocean can also be a solution to climate change. So there are a number of climate risks and issues in Africa. I will not really go into that, but I just would like to mention that the issue of climate change in Africa has a really devastating impact on our ocean and also on livelihoods. So moving to the second question, which is to really understand how climate policy in Africa, they've really integrated ocean-related actions in all of this. First, just a bit of background into what mitigation and adaptation is in the ocean context. We have seen that a lot of institutions and even researchers have come up with this nexus between climate and ocean, and also the importance of really identifying these nexus in order for us to provide necessary solutions. We have seen also that the IPCC reports, including the AR6, really raised the need to examine possibility for integrating ocean-based adaptation and mitigation options as a foundation for climate change decision making. Recently, as a result of advocacy and push by the research community and the NGO, we can see that now the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, SEPSTA, are now tasked with the objective of convening a yearly ocean climate dialogue. And of course, this puts ocean issues on the climate change agenda and process. So I will do a little bit of a summary here to really let you see how we have been able to evaluate the progress of various African climate change policies, as they have, trying to look at the ways and how they have integrated ocean actions in those policies. And because of the scope of these projects and timing, we were not really able to look into all the policies. We have several of them. We have the national determined contribution, we have the national action plan, we have the national adaptation plans, which are mostly in agreement with the Paris Agreement. But we also really look into the fact that some of these policies are either focused on the combination of mitigation and adaptation, while some of them are just focused on adaptation. So for us to really save time and resources, we were able to really focus on the NDCs, just considering the fact that they are both, the NDCs looks into both mitigation and adaptation, and also we were able to look into 15 NDCs across Africa, taking advantage of the various regions. So in each region, we were able to analyze three NDCs, and we ensured that in those three NDCs, there are countries, the NDC also represents SID. So And regarding the combination or composition of our team, we were able to analyze documents both in French and English.
Ibukun, just to say you have about 2 minutes left, please.
Okay, so I will move directly to some of the results that we do have, because time will not permit me to really take you through the methodology. But in West Africa, for example, we can see that some of the ocean intervention area, which includes offshore renewable energy, marine conservation and protection, decarbonizing shipping, most West African countries really did not fare well, particularly on offshore ocean renewable energy, but they really had very strong integration regarding conservation. And this could be as a result of their strong commitment to biodiversity conservation through the CBD. And for countries in Central Africa, the focus mainly was on livelihood. So in the intervention area of people-centered actions, you can see that most Central African countries most Central African countries experience this type of livelihood actions in their policies. And of course, I will not be able to cover because we have about 5 regions that we identified, including Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and Northern Africa. But the most important thing to really highlight here is that we have been able to deduce some recommendations according to the results of these analyses. And part of those recommendations were juxtaposed with various ongoing UNFCCC processes. So this allowed us to come up with several options that African negotiators going to Egypt can leverage on. And I will quickly move to those recommendations in 2 minutes. Yep. So the first is we considered various UNFCCC processes, and looking at mitigation, our results points to the fact that African negotiators must really consider, the potential contribution of African blue carbon in climate mitigation. That is the first. And also possibly request the IPCC to really put out some clarification on the adoption of geoengineering as a mitigation action or option for climate change in Africa. In terms of adaptation, we believe, the evidence that we have points to the fact that the efforts must really be emphasized, particularly regarding the blue carbon ecosystem that we have in Africa, and how livelihood of coastal communities depends on them. And of course, there's a need to mobilize tools to support African countries to really identify the potential of this ecosystem. So I will not be able to cover adaptation in total, but of course the report is almost 90% done, and I believe that it can be shared with the audience in due course. But one aspect that I would like to really touch on before I stop is on climate finance. So the recommendation that we are proposing is that the Standing Committee on Finance negotiators should call for the strengthening of ocean-based climate action under the 2022 Standing Committee on Finance Forum. that is almost coming up every 2 years. And of course, in terms of finance, also Global Environmental Facility is one mechanism that the UNFCCC process is deploying to provide funding for climate adaptation and mitigation. So it is our belief that negotiators going to Egypt in November should really advocate for some sort of transboundary program, particularly utilizing the ocean actions and ocean-based policies that African countries are implementing, and that are also coming up from their NDCs. And also there's a need to call for some sort of reduction in the application for funding, because we've seen that some of the application requirements are stringent and which does not cover ocean-based action.
Well, is it possible to wind up now? So, oh, thank you very much.
Yes, it's so long, and of course, I was not able to cover those important points in 10 minutes. But of course, once you read through the report, I'm sure that a lot of questions come up. And based on what I've been able to present now, I'm looking forward to questions that come in too. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very sorry to have wound both of you up. But as Ibukun mentioned, these reports are now available for comment, and we're looking forward to having people review it and give us inputs to finalize these reports. So please feel free to reach out to Ibukun and Armani. We did want to have some time for questions, and there are some interesting questions in the chat. So can we perhaps pull some of these together? We had a question asking around, for both of you, I think, saying that even if we succeed in building an evidence-based position for Africa, you guys have done a great job of showing that we have the knowledge and we have a lot of information that is really important to organize and give to the policymakers. How will it ultimately benefit the continent? So I don't know who wants to answer that question.
Please, can you repeat the question again? I couldn't.
There was a question saying that even if we build an evidence-based position, African position, how will it benefit the continent? Like, what are the sort of next steps towards making these documents useful, I think is the question.
So,
Laura, do you want to?
Okay. I think, Laura, you want to go first, or actually? Yeah.
Okay, let me jump in. So, I mean, I think we all need to recognize the level of impact that we're talking about, right? So this is very much at that very slow intergovernmental level, which takes years and years and years to negotiate, but is very important in terms of setting the scene for what actually happens on the ground. So if you can sort of get buy-in to particular approaches, you can get agreement from countries, and you can in particular see how funding can be oriented towards some projects rather than others. I think that's where having a common African position is extremely important. It's also just to have a sense that it's not just one country that's trying to advocate for a particular aspect, you know, as Mohammed was saying around sort of our grassy ecosystems, you know, this is a big gap in a lot of the international literature. And so to have a proper African voice that says, no, our ecosystems look like this, you can't just come and copy paste solutions from elsewhere in here, having sort of that even discourse appreciated at that level can then give a much stronger hand to whether it's NGOs, communities, people who are advocating for this kind of work, or who are receiving the funds to do this work on the ground. So it does have that sort of trickle down. I hate to use that term. It does have that aspect to it, but it's, you know, it's not in and of itself going to necessarily change what's happening in particular places directly.
Thank you, that's helpful. Ibukun, if you want to add to that, but can I also ask you to answer a question from Declan asking, is there any current review of olivine enhanced weathering in African coastal areas?
Oh, so just responding to the first question, the importance of this work, particularly for an African position, is that first, the language that science speaks does not really sometimes correlate with what negotiators or decision makers understand. So this is in a way of really bridging that gap so that at the end of the day, we can have some concise talking notes or talking points that negotiators can refer to. And of course, I will emphasize that some of the positions here, we really still go through some level of crystallization. You know, we need negotiators or those that are versed with negotiating to look into it, change some of the languages where, if possible. So that is one thing. And regarding the question from Declan, I hope I can see it again.
Olivine enhanced weathering, or I don't know if I pronounced it right.
Enhanced weathering, yeah. So it's a problem that has also been identified in the report. For example, there are several, proposal for geoengineering, maybe cloud seeding or ionization of the ocean, which are very, they are very problematic as it is now because we don't have enough evidence to show their utility. And also there is, within the scientific community, we still do not have, there's a lot of what I call apprehension regarding those attempts or those options. And for the African continent, this kind of intervention, there is a strong opposition to it. And considering the fact that the African negotiators really are focusing more on adaptation, on climate adaptation and not mitigation, simply because Africa Africa is feeling the brunt of the climate crisis, but we kind of contribute less to the global CO2 emissions. So those kind of interventions, geoengineering, they are not really on the table for now.
Thank you. We've reached the end of our time, but I'd like, if possible, to have one more question, perhaps aimed at Armani. William Bond asked, where does reliable water quantity and quality fit in ecosystem management and climate change? So moving beyond storing carbon, Armani, I think you did a great job of showing that there's livelihoods and biodiversity and carbon. I think William's asking, where does water fit into that?
So within the climate action debate that I have seen, the framework that is available now doesn't seem to put a lot of emphasis on the other environmental co-benefit of nature and natural resources. But I'm aware that in the other sustainability schemes, which are a bit more advanced in terms of their conceptualization of the ecosystem services, these issues with water quality and water quality availability are very important. So for instance, if you take any of the certification schemes, there's this idea that's called the high conservation values, which are forest or natural ecosystem areas that have important implication for water provision and watershed maintenance or conservation. And these kind of areas are supposed to be identified and well protected within the framework of the sustainability schemes. But in looking through the literature, most of the proposals often focus mostly only on carbon, and even the biodiversity part that I'm talking about is an extension that we spend a lot of time looking for actual evidence to support. So these are often not covered within the current proposals, particularly for grassy ecosystem. And I think William is right, because some of the evidence that we have about on afforestation, for instance, is that in more drier countries, particularly in Southern Africa, they tend to have such a huge negative consequence on water availability, which these climate proposals don't really consider much.
Great. Yeah, I think that's an important point. So we're sort of formally bringing to the end the formal part of our proceedings. I want to very much thank the speakers for their fascinating views. And anyone who is wanting further information, please be in touch with Ibukun or Mohammed, and we are welcoming feedback on these reports.